Good morning. I think we can get started. My name is Luca Belli. I work for the Council of Europe, and I would like to welcome to this workshop on network neutrality and infrastructure enhancement. Today we will discuss with our distinguished panelists. From right to left, we will have Parminder Singh from ICT4Chain, Michele Bellavite from Telecom Italia and Etno, Chris Riley from Mozilla, Carolina Rossini from Public Knowledge, and Elvana Taci from the Council of Europe. Unfortunately, Anna almost was not able to join us, but we will try to replace her with your inputs and suggestions. So, I would like to get started with some perspective on net neutrality and some social values, that should be balanced with the need to promote infrastructure, and that should be taken into consideration in order a field. And I would like to start by
net neutrality violations. And our problem here is, how do we make the policymaker and people understand that a free service is a problem? And it's not difficult if we capture it in a value-based media regulations and freedom of expression kind of frameworks, then we need to start doing it. And the last point, I hope I have a minute. Is about, I've been thinking about what really to do with, I mean, it's good to have values, good to have, good paradigms, but then you need to make progress. And I think I read it in one of the Chris blogs, which was forwarded by somebody, but I didn't clearly read the full part of it, but it was something about that we need to separate into two kinds of internets. One is the typical broadcast services which are using the IP, which is a server to the peer to the client kind of services, and other is the peer-to-peer network, which should be claimed as a public network, and that has to be essentially always net neutral. I think people would be beaming World Cup matches in the manner they want to do it using the IP services, and probably it's a time to separate those two kinds of services and reclaim the peer-to-peer public internet as clearly a net neutral internet. And what shouldn't be allowed is to mix the two. So Google, if it is on the internet, cannot mix the search results from a net neutral internet and a tiered internet. So if you separate the internet where the content providers can pay to push as a different IP managed services, but the public internet is reclaimed in its core values. I think that could be one of the possible directions to go. I haven't given it as much thought as I should have, but I think we need to start talking about practical solutions.
Thanks for this, Parminder. And we see that states have a really difficult role to play in balancing these conflicting interests, political, social, economic interests that are frequently conflicting. So what is, in your view, the role that states should play, particularly with regard with investments in the developing market?
Okay, two responses to this. That one is that even in the US, where there was a lot of gut feeling against regulation of the internet, and organizations as libertarian like the electronic EEF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, have changed their views, and they say, no, for net neutrality, we need some kind of a regulation. So I think there is no net neutrality without regulation. I think that should be obvious. There is a domination by market of concentration of market power, which can only be resisted by the right kind of regulation. So we should get over this artificial things which we have created in our mind, that internet is free for all, which has cost us a lot. So the state obviously is there, and there's no net neutrality without regulation. And the second part, I think, is that net neutrality is connected to the larger internet architecture, and local community networks, decentralized infrastructure itself is a part of that game, whereby we have a net neutral internet which is also decentralized, and therefore the municipality and the community networks which are supported by public funds become a part of it. I think those two concepts are connected. We're talking about the whole internet architecture being a digital level playing field, and at various levels, the state and the public authorities, including at the infrastructure and the regulation level, they have an important role, but we know that the elephant in the room is that states' innate tendency to try to control the informational space of the society which runs over the internet, and therefore there has to be adequate safeguards in the state's role. As a principle, I'm able to state it, but I wouldn't be able to go into details, but as principles, if we recognize the role of the state and the need of safeguards, I think we can go forward.
Thanks, Parminder. So, keeping on analyzing human rights and social implications on net neutrality also for infrastructure enhancement. So, I would like to go to Carolina and ask you, how does net neutrality principle affect and relates to network enhancement from a human rights perspective?
Sure. So, first, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Luca, for the invitation. I'm Carolina Rossini, I'm Brazilian, and now I work kind of part-time in Brazil, part-time in the US with public knowledge. So I think my relation here, it's for us who have been working in all the layers of internet, from infrastructure to the social layer, the relation is clear, how human rights impact in all of that, and actually how investment is done and should be regulated in all the layers, right? So as you all guys know, human rights often emerge out of the struggle in social process in all levels, right? Human rights are universal, and it's more than freedom of expression and privacy that we hear every day. It's actually about cultural, economic, and political rights of view, but also what values should be also elements in solving that question on what drives investment. And in our case, investment on infrastructure, right? We do have a very important role of states, and of course, coming from Brazil, I have this perspective of the state has a strong investor on infrastructure, and why it came upon that, right? And so for us who work with human rights, I think we need to understand how these values, how the human rights values should be balanced when devising a certain regulatory environment, and they will of course weight differently in different countries and cultures, right? That's why I was giving the Brazilian example, because many times human rights, they actually become constitutional rights. In Brazil, for example, the right to education is a constitutional right, is a constitutional guarantee. All should have access.
And if there is some room from state subsidized network infrastructure, if there is some need for state subsidized infrastructure.
I was entering that right now. So the companies in the market in general, and we know that, they do underinvestment, right? They are driving by demand that pushes for infrastructure enhancement in many levels. So net neutrality, we need that exactly to prevent this ISP control on when and how they do investments are made, and when and how we need this regulatory intervention. We need to be able to monitor, and of course, if there is need for more investment, then we're gonna negotiate as a society in each country if it's gonna be the government, for example, build roads, right? Build a series of infrastructure, build schools, distributes computers. We have both in US and in Brazil broadband plans. So in Brazil, the government is setting a series of infrastructure all over the country. And actually, I would love to hear more. We have some colleagues here in the audience that do work on digital networks built by cities in US, and also we have the same case in Brazil. So there is a role exactly to allow that cultural diversity and self-determination to happen. Anyway, so my last message here to close is that if we have these fast lanes, right, these fast lanes that are not justifiable on data and transparent data, we're gonna have the risk to destroy the free flow of information, the diverse cultural expression, which innovation is part of, right? Innovation is an expression of your own culture and your ability to innovate, and of course needs to be based on infrastructure. And in many cases, the national identity, which also can increase the wealth, the racial and the gender gap. So that's a little bit my message and how all those things relate. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolina. So as you were mentioning prioritization, I would like to ask Chris Riley to elaborate a little bit on how prioritization and maybe also sender side-based model could affect network investment, if they can stimulate them or reduce them, and how can they affect network capacity.
Thanks, Luca. If you don't mind, I'm going to build into that a little bit. So the first thing I want to say is that there's, in my perception, a prevalent fallacy in the developed world, and that is that investment in networks and the internet ecosystem is mostly driven by the degree of regulation. I don't think that is true. I think the thing that is most driving it is competition. I realize there's a correlation between those two things. I promise I'll get to that later. But I just want to put the emphasis on competition rather than the degree of regulation as the key factor in investment here. Most of my experiences in the developed world, I think competition is also very key in the developing world. I mean, especially when your baseline is a single state-run network operator, but I'll let my colleagues talk more about that, so I wanted to sort of qualify and say most of my thoughts on this are based in the developed world. So with that backdrop, my thesis is that net neutrality is a pro-investment policy because it is a pro-competition policy when done right, and I promise I'll get to that later too. The reason I make that argument is net neutrality drives competition over the delivery of an open internet service, drives competition to make that service faster, more reliable, and cheaper. And the absence of net neutrality, a world where we have tolerable sender-side payments for priority or other arrangements, it creates a world where there's a risk of competition over different things, over things like who do you give priority to or who do you have a deal with, and some of those things are not as dependent on investment as competition over a faster and more reliable internet service. So my assumption and my belief underlying all of this is that there is a way to do net neutrality that promotes competition through healthy exceptions for specialized services, reasonable network management, and in the case of the US, through forbearance and tailored use of authority to get there. And I know that that's not a universally agreed position. So those are that's where I come at this debate, and happy to talk about this more in questions.
Excellent. So as we were also facing the need or not need for state subsidized network enhancement, in your perspective, would this kind of subsidies be useful or could be harmful and can harm the markets, can reduce competition, or would they be an interesting tool to better enhance and extend networks and network capacity?
I think this is definitely very different in different environments, and to some degree, the role of the state is somewhat independent from net neutrality. I mean, state subsidy also, I think Parminder was alluding to this as well, like there's a state involvement everywhere. It's a question of what and how much rather than how much, and state subsidies can take the form of tax incentives for investment into infrastructure and facilitation of cell tower siting and a whole host of other things that aren't really, there's a sliding scale here all the way up to state provisioning, and different solutions make sense in different environments. I mean, there's a really open and interesting question in the United States now, which is how do we get to the point where we encourage municipalities to take broadband into their own hands when they don't feel the market has been serving the needs of their citizens? And I think we've seen some really good experiments on that in some parts of the United States, and I think these things are fascinating, and again, I think they're pro-competitive when done right.
Excellent. So I would like to go to Elvana to provide a little overview of the work that the Council of Europe is doing with regard to net neutrality, particularly to protect, develop a recommendation to protect freedom of expression and the right to privacy in the context of net neutrality. And then we will elaborate a little bit on how this can perhaps affect network enhancement.
Thank you. My name is Elvana Taci, and just a little introduction of the organization where I come from. I work for the Council of Europe, which is an intergovernmental organization including 47 European member states. I worked in the area of policy development on media and internet issues. Before we address the question of investment and to what is the need for investment, I think we need to get the issue framing right. And we need to frame the issue of network neutrality from the different perspectives that we come from. And I will try to explain how we have framed the issue of network neutrality in the Council of Europe. For us, there is no doubt that there is a clear and a direct relationship between freedom of expression and network neutrality. And the highest decision-making body in the Council of Europe, that is the Committee of Ministers of the 47 member states, has stated that interference with traffic management can have an impact on access to information of individuals. And as an interference with access to information and the right to freedom of expression, it has to meet three tests. It has to be legal, proportionate to the need that is there, and to pursue a legitimate aim. In 2012, we had a very strong pronouncement by the European Court of Human Rights, which also is based in Strasbourg, where the Council of Europe is based. And the court there said that the right to freedom of expression applies not only to the content of information, but also to the means of transmission of information. And that is a legal rationale for us to establish the link between network neutrality and the right to freedom of expression. So on that basis, we are now developing guidelines for our member states on policy guidelines for our member states on network neutrality. And some of the principles that we are considering to include in those guidelines are non-discrimination of content and services of competitors by internet service providers of competitive services, dissociation of content, of decision-making on content from traffic management decision-making. And another principle is that preferential treatment of content based on commercial arrangements should not result in a negative, should not negatively impact access to information that is generally and publicly available. And there is also a principle which is still being considered and not endorsed yet by our member states, but it's being considered to impose must-carry rules on internet service providers, so that content which meets general public interest criteria is really available to the individuals. So I'd like to consider this discussion from that, framing it from that perspective, and maybe if we get the framing right, then we also get towards a conclusion as to what the investment should be and what should the role of states be. So thanks.
Excellent, thank you. So now I would like to reduce a little bit the geographical perspective from the Council of Europe area to the EU area, and to ask to Michele, to what extent does the current regulatory environment in the European Union give room to the ISPs to address network enhancement and to promote network enhancement, and if anything should be changed?
Thank you, Luca, and thank you for the invitation. First of all, I would like to say that I will try to bring the perspective of European telecom operators, and this perspective is influenced to a large extent by the recent proposal of the European Commission on network neutrality within the policy debate on the telecom single matter regulation. So my position will be a bit influenced by recent developments. I think the title of the workshop is very, very interesting because it gives us the possibility to link the net neutrality debate to infrastructure enhancement, so to move away from ideological position and frame the debate with a clear objective, that is that of developing infrastructure. The situation that we have today in the EU as telecom operators is that we are very regulated on the market side at wholesale level, so we cannot really say that infrastructure development has been the main objective in terms of leaving commercial freedoms to operators to invest in network development. On the net neutrality side, I think that we have very, very largely agreed principles, largely agreed worldwide in terms of defending users' rights to access content and application of their choice. That's something taken for granted and something everybody agrees upon. And the fact that internet must be available to as many people as possible. So these principles are okay. On the demand side, it gets more difficult because then the big discussion is about how to define traffic management and how to avoid bad legislation. When we try to define a network neutrality principle, we try to sometimes create regulation for problems that do not exist. So the idea is that once users' rights are well defined in legislation and they are protected and authorities are empowered to intervene ex post in case of infringement of users' rights, I think we have a good framework to let innovation and new business model emerge in the market. If with the intent of defending net neutrality, as it is to some extent happening now in the EU, policymakers try to intervene in the way companies and the market have to develop business models and block their ability to innovate and try to predefine the way the market should work, then we enter into the case of bad legislation, and this is something I think we should really avoid to any extent if the objective is that of making the market grow, having internet available to everybody, and new services, new applications, and innovation.
Thank you for highlighting that one of the objectives is obviously to enhance network, but it is also to protect fundamental rights of users. So it is very important to frame the debate rightly in order to understand how to enhance network. So given that you were speaking about the current regulatory debate in Europe, in the European Union level, so which are, according to your opinion, the main challenges that should be tackled, and that what would you recommend as an essential point to be discussed and further improved within this framework?
Well, as I said at the very beginning, my perspective is influenced by the recent developments at EU level. We found ourselves confronted with a draft legislation that was proposed by the European Commission last year, which was something we liked when it was proposed because it was very forward-looking and very pro-market development. It has now undergone a very tough intervention by the European Parliament. Now negotiations are still on, but we see many, many risks in terms of bad legislation that will intervene in the way, first of all, by limiting companies' ability to do specialized services, network management, and limit their ability to innovate. And on the other hand, these risks to create a sort of legislative framework by way of a regulation that also impedes regulatory authorities or governments to intervene in specific cases of market failure or infringement of users' rights and infringement of other aspects of the principle of net neutrality. So defining by law, by means of a strict regulation, the way the market should work is not only not good for companies that want to invest in networks and develop new services, is also a problem for implementing authorities that we find themselves confronted with very strict regulation, and this will create a case for big disputes in front of different levels of implementation, which can be national tribunals, the European Court of Justice, infringements opened by the European Commission, a great level of uncertainty, both for users and for market players.
Okay, excellent for this. Thank you for these comments, and I'm sure that some remarks can be made from the panel, or for sure from the audience. If maybe I think Paramir has a remark from the panel, then I will take a couple of other remarks from the panel, and then I will open the debate to the floor.
Yeah, my comment is on Alvana's basic frame, the Council of Europe's basic framing of the principles. And I agree that the idea is to first frame the issue and then talk about how and what of it. But I was intrigued with one principle, if I heard it right, was that commercial preference of content should be subject to the constraint that it should not reduce any publicly available information or some variation of that, which actually introduced the concept of commercial preferential treatment in a very explicit manner. So I just want to understand whether I heard it correct and you actually agree that there could be commercial preferential treatment of content. And a small comment about which I started with, that I think the dialogue has to be kept at values and human rights level before we enter other domains. And my colleague from the EU Telecom Operators Union, which said that we are able to shift from the ideological viewpoints, and I think for me that is the problem. Human rights are ideological. There's no rational basis for human rights. They are ideological. Our highest principles, constitutional principles, are ideological. And we need to frame our debates first that that's the society we want. We will see how to get it, but those principles, and that's why I said media pluralism, media freedom, quality education for all, these are issues which come before we talk about the market and the technologies of the issue. So first of all, for me, net neutrality is an ideological debate. Thank you.
Is there any reaction from the panel, Ivana, I think? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the question. The principle is that, yes, I think you had heard it right. The principle that is being considered at the moment is not yet finalized. I should underline that, is that preferential treatment of content is not prohibited per se, but commercial arrangements for preferential treatment should not have a negative impact on accessibility of information that is publicly available otherwise. So this is, in a nutshell, the principle that is being discussed and considered in the Council of Europe.
Yes, Chris, and then Michael, I think you have some reactions.
I started to hear a little bit more of the fallacy that I referenced earlier, that there is a direct connection between regulation and restriction of business models, and that they are all inherently bad. And I do not agree with that. I like the emphasis on human rights, and I want to make an economic case as well in pointing to the FCC's theory of the virtuous innovation cycle, or I forget the exact terminology for it, but the idea that a neutral network facilitates people choice for content, ability to produce content, that in turn feeds back into demand for the internet access services, and that in turn stimulates investment into the network to supply for that demand. And if we are talking about business models that interfere with that, I do think that there is a repercussion there for investment, for competition as well, and for the health of the internet ecosystem as a whole.
Okay, I think, Michele, do you have a reaction?
I think I agree with your point. When I said we have to avoid ideological approaches, I of course didn't mean that we do not have to look at fundamental rights and things, as you say, like media pluralism, access to everybody, open internet, ability to access content and application of the consumer choice that's taken for granted. And I think that sometimes we lose the perspective that consumers are our market. So we are firstly and in the first place interested for more and more people to access and to use more and more bandwidth. That's our main goal, basically, to keep our market going. So that's for sure. When I said ideological, I mean that we found ourselves confronted with a legislative debate where regulation tries to find a solution to a problem that does not exist by thinking that, in our case, for example, but it might be the case for other players along the value chain, that we may have bad behavior and they want to fix ex ante the way we should work and make the market and do business models, because there is a preconception on the idea that we might behave badly. If we behave bad, we have authorities to come and check our behavior and fix it in some way. That was my idea of being ideological, is doing regulation in a way where you try to look for a problem that doesn't actually exist because it's not been proven. And I know Luca probably doesn't agree that much, but that's my point of view.
Okay, yeah, well, I just refer to the BEREC report on traffic management of 2012 to further information on the problems of traffic management. Now, I would like to open the debate because I see that there are a lot of people interested in intervening. I see that Luigi Gambardella wants to intervene.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very interesting workshop. And I didn't resist. I tried, but I didn't really. I think we have to be very careful not to mix up the things. Because one issue is the issue of the networks and the discussion on net neutrality, and the other issue is the access to information, which is a very important issue. And maybe we should focus much more on this rather than the problem of the network, because with the network, the problem is not to have access, but there are other issues to be discussed. Let me focus a little bit and to be provocative on access to information, because let's invent a new word, is information neutrality. If we look today, and I would ask the panelists and maybe also the participants to the workshop, if the idea is that all the citizens should have the right to have access to all the information, we should start to jump into the issue of what kind of information they should have the right to. Because today, the system on the internet, which is done by publishers, an internet provider, is freemium. So we have a certain kind of content are free, are accessible, other you have to pay. What do we do with that? There are some citizens that cannot afford to pay for content, who have access to the information, even basic information. How we treat it? So I think we focus too much on network, which we, from our point of view, we can discuss this, does not exist any problem of access. We are speaking about only a possibility to differentiate, to have better quality and new services, from what the Council of Europe was saying, and their focus on access to information, which has nothing to do with the debate on net neutrality versus network management. So I think, what kind of right we believe the citizens should have? So we want that all the information should be free on the internet. All the citizens should have right. Why I cannot afford to pay Financial Times? I cannot have access to Financial Times. I want to be provocative, obviously. So I think such kind of discussion maybe would be also very interesting to develop further.
Yes, thank you. And in case, I think the Council of Europe perspective is that some traffic management practices do have an impact on access to information, but I think that Elvana has a reaction on this.
Thank you, if I may. I don't think we are discussing here what rights citizens have. The rights that citizens have are already determined in binding international law. For example, in the European Convention on Human Rights, they have a right to freedom of expression, and that applies regardless of the mediums, that applies regardless of frontiers. So that question is
So for you, the right to information is not a right?
Is not the issue. Whether citizens have the right to information is not up for question, really. This is a recognized right in legally binding instruments.
Could you let her finish?
For the Council of Europe, the right to information is not a right.
The right to
You don't have a right
I'm
to be
saying,
informed.
I'm
You
saying
don't have a
that
right to have access to information. Just clarify.
Yeah, there is one there and one there.
I think, thank you.
I didn't finish. I didn't finish.
Okay, yeah, please let her. No. Please finish and then we can take the questions there.
So individuals have a right to access to information, and that is a legally binding, set out in legally binding instruments. You can go to a court, actually, in every jurisdiction and seek remedy if you think that your right to freedom of expression has been violated and access to information. So we are not discussing that question. The question we are discussing is the link between access to information and access to infrastructure and network. And the European Court of Human Rights, which I mentioned in my intervention, has clearly stated that there is a direct link between the right to information and the means of transmission of information. And the right to information applies to the means of transmission of information. So this is the point I'd like to stress here.
So I think there are a lot of questions. I would like to take 3 questions and then to have some reactions from the panel. The gentleman, then Rosalind, then the other gentleman there.
Here?
Hello, Pedro Les from Google. Just to build on top of Luis Cambardela's comment, I think that we need to make a difference here between services that are provided as a result that they are a public good, that is, a license, and there is basically a concession from the government from services that are built on top and they are offered either for free or by a subscription. And I think that we are deviating the conversation here from the main topic that has to do with access and infrastructure. I think that we can talk about access to information and all the challenges that we are facing, even from an intermediary perspective or from the people that want to access information. But I don't think that this is the issue here right now.
Thank you. Then another question from Rosalind and then the gentleman there.
Question for Carolina on Brazil. Please address infrastructure situation in Brazil. I know you framed this in terms of operators and regulators, but deploying infrastructure is really a community activity which takes in municipalities, property landlords, and so on. In the case of Brazil, you have 5,500 municipalities, over 250 rules and regulations that you have to comply with if you want to deploy a national network. The Anatel, the Brazilian regulator, has recognized that operators could earn more if they could have more coverage, and Brazilian consumers are willing to pay more. The challenge is getting over the regulations that are there today, so please address. Just quickly on Marco Civil, a number of privacy advocates have raised concerns that the rule requiring the data, operators maintain data on their customers for a period of time is actually at odds with a number of human rights ideals about privacy and security. So, and also the Marco Civil gives untold power to the executive branch to define net neutrality and violations. So could you please address that in the human rights context?
And we have a question from Gonzalo there.
Hi, this is Gonzalo Pedarajas from Telefónica. I will focus my question on the relation between network deployment and net neutrality. The question here is the proposals of regulation of net neutrality will not enable specialized services if they somehow hamper the internet access service. This will mean that services such as voice over LTE, VoLTE, or IPTV will be could not be provided by telecoms. as for example, Google TV service explains in its terms of service that the service could hamper the internet access service. So my question here is, for example, would Google have deployed its Google Fiber if they were not allowed to offer their Google TV service?
Thanks for the question. I think there are reactions there, and then we will get more questions thereafter. Who would like to be first? I think Carolina.
I can go very briefly, and just for transparency of my background, I actually worked for Terra and Telefonica for 7 years before going to academia and civil society. I worked for them in Brazil and actually wrote many of those contracts. And so there are two issues in Brazil, right? We finally have approved Marco Civil after 7 years of negotiation. You all guys know, but I'm happy to share that information with you. The principle of net neutrality is there. There's going to be a public consultation starting hopefully after the elections, but of course both Anatel already has a stack of reports under their arms, and we hopefully through CGI Brazil we're going to start building also the position of CGI, because both will inform the decision of the executive to issue the decree that's going to then regulate net neutrality in Brazil. And exactly because we are in this transition moment, there are a lot of things at odds, as you pointed out very well, that you have, I don't know if that's the correct word, but like a fragmented regulation. Brazil does have federative systems, and different bodies have different issues. At the city level, the regulation is much more based on where and how you can deploy infrastructure, but not what happens with that infrastructure. That's gonna be done by Anatel and our antitrust agency, which is CADE. And I would hope that, I'm not sure if CADE is prepared for that yet, so I hope CGI engages with our antitrust agency too. In terms of data mandate, I do think they are also at odds with some of the human rights issues, but again, I think with the human rights regulation, we're gonna have that under debate again to understand exactly how that can benefit some populations in Brazil and how that cannot. And at some point, we hope that population, those groups, right, all of us actually in Brazil, that engage with this have a clear choice if we have a clear transparency of what that means, and if that does hinder or not their access to information and all the other human rights I addressed here. So I think we have a duty here to actually raise awareness, do some capacity building, and really push the button on transparency to enable the country take decisions on what makes sense for us based on the constitutional rights established in Brazil. So that's a little bit, again, how she said, is the context where this discussion is going to happen in Brazil. Thank you.
Let's had some reactions on the questions.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Gonzalo's very, very good question about specialized services and their impact on the open internet service. I am very happy to acknowledge that for many carriers, the ability to offer multiple services over the same essential connection is key to their value proposition. I think that's been demonstrated by a lot of different carriers in the past. And I think we can work this out. I think we can make these things work properly together. I mean, when you're talking about DOCSIS 3 or fiber on the fixed side, when you're talking about LTE and LTE advanced and mobile, there's a lot of capacity in that pipe. And I think there's a way to support at the same time separate specialized services that I would probably not call specialized services like IPTV and voice over LTE, and an open internet connection, all in the same pipe, all without interfering with the use of the open internet access service in the way that proponents of net neutrality would like. So thank you for raising that. I think it's an important thing. I think we should talk about it more in the US. We're not talking about it very much. I know it's talked about a fair bit in Europe, and I'm glad for that, but I think we should be talking about that more.
So I have one question here, one there, and one there. So.
Hi, it's Madura Vijay, and I'm from Comcast Corporation. We're the largest ISP in the US. And just as more of a question or a comment to Chris, I think, from Mozilla. I mean, I have an economics and a legal background, and one of the things that I've sort of really been wondered about, sort of noticed in the net neutrality debate is that there are so many lawyers and engineers involved and very few economists involved. And that's I think that's a telling thing because I come from both worlds, and so you kind of look at things differently. And on your point about investment not being affected by regulation, there's a lot of research that it's affected, the regulations are less important, I think. So there's a lot of research that shows that macroeconomic effects, aggregate demand and other things, and also the laws and regulations, they both interact to work. And there's some research that shows the macroeconomic effects are great, the other ones that show that the laws and regulations are important. I think one of the reasons why Comcast has continues to support the 2010 open internet rules that the FCC put out, and we're actually bound by them. And we hope that the Commission will, through this round, come out with a policy that's enforceable so that we can move on from this to other issues. The reason why we support that is because we think that those rules balance the very complicated issues, and that's what I think the economic sort of profession, I'm sort of biased, trains you to do. You kind of look at issues and you try to balance things, and the doctrinaire, one doesn't work and then the other one's good, the other one's bad, doesn't work. So my question is, do you see that we could somehow, do you see that the net neutrality debate has sort of moved away from the balancing of equally important goals like jobs, investment, and net neutrality being a human rights issue, to being a doctrinaire issue? And how do we get it back on track so that we get something that's enforceable, that's actually going to be good for the people, and then we can move on to other issues?
Thank you. We'll take other two questions. I think you had the questions.
Well, like Madura, I'm a little surprised that this panel about infrastructure doesn't have any economists, because we might actually have somebody here who could push back against some of the assertions made by engineers and technical experts. Christopher Yu, for example, is here at the conference. He's done very good research showing very clearly that the regulations in Europe, which resemble Title II in the United States, have in fact retarded broadband deployment. There's other research in the United States that shows that after the 1992 Cable Act, that we saw a very slow investment in broadband. In 1996, when the US deregulated the market, and under the leadership of Bill Clinton's chairman, Bill Kennard, we actually saw a takeoff in investment precisely because Bill Kennard moved away from the traditional model of mandatory open access. That has encouraged competition in the United States. There's more we can do to encourage that. As Rosalind mentioned, a lot of it's about the local level. The barriers to deployment are red tape, lack of smart infrastructure. So we could be talking about all of these things. Instead, it seems that this panel is really designed to suggest that net neutrality regulation somehow promotes infrastructure investment. I don't really see any evidence of that. So my questions are, number one, for Luca, what made you think that this was a balanced approach to this issue? Did you not consider having people from the other side? Nice of you to have one carrier there, but businesses are always reluctant to say too much and to defend themselves. So what made you think that this was a balanced panel? And in the future, will you not include economists and people who could, for example, push back against the assertions made about the US experience? And then my second question for Chris. Chris, I would agree with you. There's a lot that states can do to build smart infrastructure, to lower barriers to deployment. But don't you worry about government actually running broadband networks? Wouldn't you prefer that we have a model where government encourages investment as much as it can, builds smart infrastructure like putting up poles and dig once conduits, but then leaves it to the private sector to develop in the way that, for example, Google Fiber has? And don't you also worry that Google Fiber, which deployed in several cities in the United States, yes, they offered a video product because that's not subject to heavy regulation in the United States, but they chose not to offer a voice product because that is subject to heavy regulation, what we call Title II. So what lessons do you take from Google Fiber's experience?
Thanks, and the last question and then the reactions.
Good morning. I would like just give complementary information about Marco Civil da Internet. I'm from Brazil, and I'm from Proteste, Consumers Association, and one of 4 representatives of CGIBR. It's important to consider that the regulation process of Marco Civil da Internet will be about the exceptions of the neutrality principle, which is fundamental to ensure freedom of expression, access to information, and privacy. It's important to consider that neutrality as a principle and as a right independs of regulamentation according Marco Civil da Internet. And according Marco Civil da Internet, the CGI-BR and Anatel, the regulatory organism in Brazil, should be involved in the regulatory process of the exception of the neutrality, and this decision offers the opportunity of including the civil society participations on the debates because CGI is a multi-stakeholder entity. There will also be public consultations to enforce the regulatory decree, and this in order to attribute legitimacy and democracy to the process, like Carolina said after. Thank you.
Before the question, there's some reactions and then the next round of questions. I will abuse of my position of moderator to directly reply to the question on the panel. Everyone who has organized a workshop for the IGF knows that there are specific criteria to respect about gender balance, about geography, about stakeholder balance. Unfortunately, economists are not considered one of the stakeholders, but I will suggest to include this as one of the stakeholder category. There is always room for improvement, so next time we will make sure that an economist is here. And finally, this panel, this workshop was initially organized through a collaborative process on a mailing list, so anyone would have been able to suggest as an economist. If you want to be our economist, of Mr. Christopher, you want to be our economist at next panel, the next IGF, they are absolutely welcome to join us. Then I will open the remarks to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Luke, if you don't mind, I'll go next. The gentleman from Comcast, I may need to get you to repeat your question a little bit more after the panel, perhaps, because I was a little thrown off by the 5 or so that Baron asked immediately following you. But I liked the way that you approached that and your emphasis on balance. I feel almost as if you and I were applying a very similar framework in how we were thinking about this. We just might come to different places about where the right balance lies. So I thought your comments were very productive, and I'd like to talk more and maybe get a little bit more into your question. And then Baron, to the several things you raised, first of all, the 92 Cable Act was not about network neutrality or anything even vaguely similar to it. The network neutrality debate is not about wholesale access. So it's a lot of the deregulatory things related to wholesale access that you say stimulate competition, which I think is probably exactly accurate. That's not what we're talking about. I thought you would have loved my emphasis on competition, and now competition is the key thing we're driving for here. I'm sorry that you didn't. You cited a lot of economic research. You didn't cite the Free to Invest paper, which directly looks at network neutrality and makes the arguments that I've been making to a greater degree from economists at NYU. I appreciate your point on the government running infrastructure. I love the idea of government putting conduits and poles and opening access to these and then allowing private sector to tap into these. I think that's a great part of this model as well. My point about government was as a competition for the existing private sector broadband operators. And again, it comes from the perspective of the United States, where we really do have pretty good private sector deployment, and municipalities are emerging as competition to the existing private sector entities and are not really taking over anything in any sense. And I'd also love to see if the gentleman from Comcast agrees with your point about video not being a heavily regulated service, because I doubt he would agree with that.
Michael or Carolina, do you have any replies to that? No. Okay. To the next questions. One here, gentleman here, and then there. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for this very interesting panel, and I must say that if we want to consider economists as protected species, that would be an exception. And there are economists and economists depending on which side of the economy you come from. So I think there, if you have an economist, then please consider also being diverse about it and providing some neutrality amongst the economists. Now, the question that I really have is that, we could look at the issue of net neutrality in the sense of access to rights and so on and so forth. But if we look at it purely the technical plane, that the basic network must be neutral to whatever travels above it, and without bothering about what is the content of it. That's one way of looking at net neutrality, which is specifically looking only at the monopoly issue, competition and monopolies issue. I would submit that when you look at competition as the only issue, then there is a problem that a lot of economic issues, a lot of economic arguments, coming back to the economist, would argue that there is no demand till you create the infrastructure. So therefore, if we think that demand creates infrastructure, and that's the way to drive investments, we could argue that actually investments are driven first in particularly infrastructure, which is an externality, and only then services are provided. And then we would really need to think about, why do we want to stop at only the poles or the holes? Why don't we say the fiber and then to provide services above it? Why don't we think about public investments in infrastructure the way we do for roads?
I think there is another question and then some reactions.
Hello, I'm Chris Mitchell with the Media Democracy Fund from the United States. And one of the observations we've seen in the United States is that the best networks, the fastest speeds, are built by the second and third providers in the market. It's Google Fiber, Sonic, a company in California. It's a number of municipalities who build networks in addition to a cable and DSL network. And it's important to note these are networks built with investor funds, almost always not public dollars. But I'm curious if this trend, all of these providers respect network neutrality. They're very clear about it. And I'm curious if we see that in other countries, I'm asking the panel, where the most investment in the next generation networks comes not from incumbents, but from others who are more interested and more inclined to respect network neutrality.
Okay, so do we have some reaction from the panel?
I can try to answer the last question about other countries, whether more investment is coming not from the incumbents. In India, I think we had a much more diversified ISPs scenario a few years earlier, and there has been a shakeout, and there is a concentration of internet service provision among the major telcos rather than new providers coming on.
Excellent. So if we don't have any other reaction, I think there will be more questions. I see a man from EBU there, and then.
So the most net neutrality, sorry, I'm Bram Tellemans from the European Broadcasting Union. The most net neutrality is about access to the network, so it's from the end user to the access network. It almost never states what happens behind the access network. I would like to see what the role of internet exchanges would be, and you have some countries like Sweden having like 5 internet exchanges. How do you see more net neutrality there? Or is it more easy to get access to content? What is the relation between the connectivity to those open access points? These kind of questions I think should also be addressed.
Excellent. Do we have other questions? I saw Rosalind, maybe you have a question, yeah.
Just to take a quick step back, there's a movement among telecom regulators who are transitioning to developmental strategies to broadband. There has been to date the kind of what we might call regulatory approach to broadband where we regulate networks, but now regulators are beginning to understand that just measuring networks by speed, deployment, is not really what matters in a country. It's really about using broadband in a productive way. How does it increase employment, education, these kinds of things? So we've actually seen a number of European governments who are shifting their strategies to developmental strategies, even in the case of Denmark, which dismantled the telecom regulator because they realized that regulating the networks wasn't key, but instead focusing on broadband as the enabler to the society. So what this means is that they pursue a technology-neutral, market-led approach. The operators invest at probably one of the highest rates in Europe. You have utility companies involved, and it has also been, this is an amount that's as high as what the government spends on railroads, hospitals, and roadways. So I just would like to say, any thoughts about regulatory approaches that are more holistic, that instead of looking at, let's just measure, wires and towers and things, why aren't we measuring the holistic measures in the economy about things like broadband-enabled employment, education, those sorts of things?
Excellent questions. So I think we have reactions from Michele and then...
Yes. Thank you very much. Super interesting point. We have actually been working a lot as European telecom operators with European institutions and amongst ourselves to try and really try and think how to measure broadband welfare, broadband dividend, to see how this can help the population, and try also to propose new way of looking at the broadband market when we talk about universal service, universality of access. So yes, definitely something we've been working on, and I think we have found good feedback from regulators, especially from BEREC on these points. I hope we will continue to work on this way. It's definitely something that we have to look at more and more. And going back to one question that was raised before on investment from, yes, exactly, from newcomers or competitors rather than incumbents. In the EU, we have kept investing. We keep investing. Global investment from ETNO members keep growing, so we keep investing money. It's clear that competition produces this kind of effect. If you want to compete, you will invest in a better infrastructure and you will be able to compete. But today, if we go back for a second to the title of the workshop, which is again super interesting from my point of view, if we link the net neutrality debate to network enhancement, we really have to look at how market can develop today and in the future with new business model and new services that can be priced to customers. Customers will have good quality of services and will be ready in return to pay money for that. And that's the way we have to think, because like broadband penetration is going down, so broadband markets are not exploding as they were 10 years ago. Much the same is true for mobile markets. Everybody now has a smartphone, so we have to work no more on penetration and spreading access, but work on the top level, on good quality of services. If you block that level, then you really, if you block that level by bad regulation and impeding companies to develop new business models, then you really hamper the possibility also for consumers to have better services. I think sometimes the problem that we have when we look at neutrality as telecom operators is that we get money for our services. We price access, we price traffic, and we price access to the networks, while other services are like Google, Facebook, or others are for free. So maybe we are looked in a bad way because we ask for money for our services, but if we have to invest in infrastructures, we have to find money somehow, some way. I mean, that's the way it works. While for free services, they get money from other markets, and so we are more looked at the bad guys than others are, probably. But we need to get over this. We need to get over this. I think we have been discussing with over-the-top players for long now, and there is ground to work together and to agree on basic principles and to move ahead again from this old discussion net neutrality and link it to some more concrete things.
Thanks. I think Karina has a comment and then Prominder.
And just a comment there, right? I think nobody here thinks infrastructure comes from out of nowhere like a Christmas present or something. But our point is we need transparency to understand how the investment is made, was made, what is the time, how do you say in accounting, like that the things already get paid itself, I just forgot the term, and depreciation. And that type of information is really important because that's gonna determine what folks actually need to pay. And for example, if you see the contract of Netflix in the US, the moment they accepted to pay, push, the velocity, the speed went up, so the capacity was there, so they didn't need money to invest anymore on enhancing the capacity. So what is going on there, So we just need to have data and a better understanding on the costs on this value chain.
I think Parminder and then Chris, you have a...
Yeah, I agree with the lady's comment there that the regulators, the traditional telecom or FCC kind of regulators need to start thinking beyond measuring access and quality because internet is unlike the traditional telephones, which is a very, very clear, single dimensional thing. Internet is very social, basically. Internet is developmental, and we need to be talking about what actually is happening in the society and regulating from that viewpoint. And our agreement may soon end after this point that yes, it should be social, but what happens afterwards, my conceptions are different. Did I hear that in Denmark they actually dismantled the system because they found that that's a better way to go? But I would say in this case the regulator becomes more socially conscious. They're talking about internet being the basis on which the education for all is delivered, on which the health system works, and this therefore informs the way they think about the internet infrastructure. What Prabir said, that much of the benefits are going to come in the future and therefore public investments are needed. So you won't need to bring social developmental thinking to the regulator, but that for me could make different kind of changes perhaps than what you are suggesting. A lot of social and public investments come in. They probably be channels for community radio, channels for the public health system, and that kind of thinking. But the point I'm agreeing on is basically, yes, the regulators cannot take the traditional excess quality kind of approach, but it has to be very social developmental approach to what internet actually does in the society, and come back and then regulate or not regulate the internet from that perspective.
So I think Chris also had a reaction and then some more questions from the floor.
Yeah, very briefly, what I heard a little bit of there was an echo of the old Ed Whittaker, I'm not letting Google use my pipes for free comment, which is always funny when it pops up. My response to that is actually to paraphrase what Vint Cerf said at his opening remarks to the Dynamic Coalition's session yesterday morning, where he said the history of the internet is everybody pays for their access to the internet. And then there are some payments among transit providers and others and so forth. But what we're talking about here are payments for terminating access at the other end of the internet. And that is something that is extremely categorically different in the effects that it has, the externalities that it has, how you manage it. And it's not the same thing. It's not that Google is using pipes for free at the other end of the connection. I mean, Google pays for its access just as the users pay for theirs. So these are just really very different concepts, and Vint would be the first to point out that paying for terminating access after the internet is a fundamentally new and different and concerning thing.
Thank you. So I think there are 3 questions, 1, 2, and 3.
Yes, thank you, Marco Hoogwaning, Rijp NCC. I think while I like the debate here and I like what's said, and especially on the previous speaker on quality, I think we have to keep in mind that speed is not the only determinator for quality. There are other things. And I'm not going into like quality of service or fast lines. You can also think of things like IPv6 or better security. And I think there's a role there, especially also for civil society, because for the average user, yes, the markup when he walks into the shop will be the speed, and maybe collaboratively find other determinators and find a way to mark those and market those to the user so they can make a better informed choice of what constitutes a quality internet connection and not only look at, oh, this is 100 megabit and this is 150 megabit. Thank you.
Excellent point. I think Eduardo had the comment.
Yes, I'm Eduardo Bertoni. I'm a law professor and director of the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression in Argentina. I have two questions. The first one is something that has been said very briefly about the specialized services. In Argentina currently, one commission at the Senate is discussing a net neutrality law or a net neutrality regulation. That commission, following in some way the model framework that we translated into Spanish, included a provision excluding specialized service for the net neutrality provisions in the way that the model framework did. But the problem is
backbones to Africa and Europe, so we don't need to go back to US back and forth. So that's how important the state sees these things.
I think there was a final question there from Josh that raised his hand before.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I just wanted to highlight one thing that I just heard. I hear this comment a lot from people who are generally not supporters of net neutrality, that look at all these varying definitions of net neutrality. Even supporters of net neutrality can never really agree on what the definition is. And I would like to say that there's like 95% agreement among advocates for net neutrality, and that 5%, there's a lot of nuance in there, but it's a rhetorical strategy to try to divide a wedge. I just want to name that.
Josh, that is absolutely not correct, and you know it's not correct, and it's disingenuous for you to say that.
Luca, okay. may I have a comment here? I think it's worth pointing out that what's been discussed on the panel is a mix of net neutrality on the one hand and public utility regulation on the other. So Carolina's model of investment, when she said that we're just going to get together and see who's going to invest in something and then what their cost structure is, that's how public utilities worked. That's a model that was a complete failure in the United States. Bill Kennard, who was the new Democrat who led the investment policy in the United States, realized that model was a failure, realized we need to move to a model where we encourage companies to just go out and build infrastructure. And so the debate that we're having in the US at this point is no longer about net neutrality. It's about whether we're going to return to public utility infrastructure under the model of Title II, under the delusion that it allows the FCC to ban paid prioritization, which it doesn't. But Bob is exactly right here. This is not a discussion about net neutrality. It's about how you regulate the basic infrastructure and what the role of government is.
Well, that should also be part of the net neutrality debate, I guess. So,
but it's a bait and switch to suggest that if you're in favor of net neutrality, you have to be in favor of public utility regulation.
Thank you. If you don't have any final remarks, I would like to close the debate because we are running out of time. Thanks a lot for your perspectives, for your participation, for your excellent remarks and questions, and see you at the main session on net neutrality this afternoon.
Says.
All right.
Good afternoon, everybody. We'll start in 3 minutes. Thank you. Sharp.